In a bold declaration, former National Security Advisor John Bolton has strongly criticized U.S. President Donald Trump's recent threat to impose sanctions on Russia, calling the threat totally hollow and without significant impact. Bolton's remarks come in response to comments made by Trump on social media, in which the former president suggested that he would consider imposing banking sanctions and tariffs against Russia unless the ongoing war in Ukraine reached a ceasefire agreement. Trump's statement was made on Truth Social, his social media platform, and has drawn significant attention and concern from both political analysts and world leaders. His threat to impose sanctions and tariffs on Russia was positioned as an effort to pressure President Vladimir Putin into negotiating an end to the conflict in Ukraine. However, Bolton, who served as the National Security Advisor under Trump from 2018 to 2019, has now dismissed Trump's statements as empty rhetoric, offering a critical analysis of the potential impact of such measures. Trump's call for sanctions and the context of U.S. Russia relations in February, shortly after the war in Ukraine entered its second year, negotiations began between the United States and Russia in an attempt to bring about an end to the ongoing conflict. Despite some early optimism, these talks have been met with mixed reactions. European leaders, in particular, have been vocal in their criticism of Washington's approach to the negotiations, with many accusing the U.S. of sidelining the Ukrainian government and making concessions to Moscow in the name of diplomacy. Trump's remarks on social media echoed his previous statements regarding the need to balance relations between Moscow and Kyiv. The former president has long criticized U.S. involvement in overseas conflicts, calling for a more isolationist approach to foreign policy. His latest comments, however, have sparked a new round of debate over the effectiveness of such an approach in the current geopolitical landscape. On Friday, Trump wrote on Truth Social that he was strongly considering implementing banking sanctions and tariffs against Russia unless the Russian government and Ukraine reached a negotiated deal to end the fighting. He further elaborated, saying that with Russia pounding Ukraine on the battlefield, the imposition of sanctions and tariffs would be his way of forcing Moscow to the negotiating table. The former president's suggestion to impose sanctions on Russia and implement tariffs has sparked concern among policymakers, especially given the historical context of U.S. Russia relations and the existing sanctions already in place. Many analysts view Trump's threats as symbolic at best, given the current state of economic relations between the two countries. Bolton's criticism of Trump's sanction threats. John Bolton, who served as National Security Advisor under Trump, has been an outspoken critic of the former president, particularly regarding his handling of foreign policy and national security issues. Bolton's criticism of Trump's latest statements on Russia is particularly pointed, with the former advisor arguing that Trump's threats to impose sanctions and tariffs against Russia are totally hollow and would have little to no effect on Moscow's behavior. In an interview with CNN, Bolton explained that Trump's proposed banking sanctions and tariffs would be largely meaningless due to the small volume of U.S. Russia trade. Bolton pointed out that Russian exports to the U.S. amounted to a relatively modest $3 billion in 2022. This figure, according to Bolton, is significantly lower than it would need to be for sanctions or tariffs to have any substantial economic impact on Russia. Furthermore, Bolton noted that since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the volume of U.S. imports from Russia has decreased by as much as 90%, meaning any new tariffs imposed would likely have little to no effect on Russia's economy. Bolton also emphasized that Russia had already demonstrated its ability to evade U.S. sanctions, particularly those aimed at financial transactions. The Russian government, under Putin's leadership, has found ways to bypass Western sanctions through alternative financial channels, including increased trade with China and other non-Western countries. As a result, Bolton argued, Putin would view Trump's threat of sanctions as empty and not a serious deterrent. The broader context of U.S.-Ukraine relations also highlight broader concerns about the direction of U.S. foreign policy under Trump. The former president has repeatedly expressed skepticism about the U.S.'s involvement in the war in Ukraine and has called for a reduction in aid to Kyiv. His recent decisions, including freezing military aid and intelligence support to Ukraine, have led many to question whether Trump's approach to the war is weakening the U.S.-Ukraine relationship and strengthening Putin's hand in the negotiations. Bolton's concerns are shared by many foreign policy experts who argue that Trump's rhetoric and actions have emboldened Putin while undermining the Ukrainian government. Trump's freeze on military aid to Ukraine, in particular, has been seen as a significant shift from the policy of his successor, President Joe Biden, who has pledged ongoing support to Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression. European leaders, too, have voiced concerns about Trump's stance on the conflict, particularly given the strong U.S.-European alliance that has emerged in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Many European leaders fear that Trump's approach could undermine the unity of the West and create divisions within NATO, particularly as the alliance seeks to present a unified front against Russian aggression. Trump's perspective on Putin and Ukraine. In addition to his comments about potential sanctions, Trump also made a controversial statement regarding Russian President Vladimir Putin. During a visit to the Oval Office on Saturday, Trump stated that Putin wanted peace in Ukraine and that Moscow would be easier to deal with than Kyiv. Trump further suggested that Ukraine didn't have the cards to win the war, implying that Kyiv would be in a weaker negotiating position compared to Moscow. Trump's remarks have drawn sharp criticism from Ukraine and its supporters, who view the statement as both inaccurate and dangerous. Ukrainian officials have repeatedly stated that they are committed to defending their sovereignty and territorial integrity, regardless of the pressure exerted by Russia or other international actors. Additionally, many have pointed out that Putin's actions, including the invasion of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea in 2014, demonstrate a clear desire for territorial expansion rather than a genuine interest in peace. Critics argue that Trump's comments about Putin's desire for peace are misguided and reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the conflict. Putin's government has shown no willingness to negotiate in good faith, and Russia's actions on the battlefield have demonstrated a determination to achieve its objectives through force rather than diplomacy. The geopolitical implications of Trump's statements. Trump's remarks on Russia and Ukraine have far-reaching implications for U.S. foreign policy and its relationships with allies and adversaries. His calls for a more conciliatory approach to Russia have drawn comparisons to his past statements, praising Putin's leadership and questioning the value of U.S. alliances. These statements have raised concerns among U.S. allies, particularly those in Europe, who fear that a return to Trump's America First foreign policy could weaken the West's collective resolve in confronting Russia. At the same time, Trump's comments have further cemented his position as a divisive figure in American politics. His approach to foreign policy, which emphasizes unilateral action and skepticism toward multilateral agreements, has alienated many traditional allies and raised questions about the long-term viability of U.S. leadership in global affairs. The war in Ukraine continues to unfold. The geopolitical landscape remains uncertain. The outcome of the conflict will have profound implications, not only for Ukraine and Russia, but also for the future of international relations. In this context, the statements made by Trump and Bolton represent the ongoing debate over the role of the United States in global conflicts and the strategies that should be employed to address international crises. Conclusion. In summary, John Bolton's criticism of Donald Trump's threat to impose sanctions on Russia highlights the growing divide within U.S. foreign policy circles regarding the approach to Russia and Ukraine. While Trump's statements may have been intended to convey a strong stance on Russia, Bolton's analysis suggests that the former president's threats are largely symbolic and unlikely to have any meaningful impact on Moscow's behavior as the war in Ukraine continues and diplomatic efforts to reach a ceasefire persist. The stakes for U.S. foreign policy have never been higher. The actions and rhetoric of leaders like Trump and Bolton will continue to shape the international response to the crisis, with significant implications for the future of U.S. Russia relations, NATO, and global conflict in Ukraine. The shifting dynamics of international diplomacy and the potential for a changing U.S. leadership all serve as critical elements in the unfolding geopolitical drama. As the world watches, the decisions made in Washington will continue to reverberate across the globe.